Well, hello again. Thank you very much for your patience. I do hope the coffee was great. The next hour is dedicated to this panel, and somehow in the last minutes I'm in charge to moderate it because my manager had to leave urgently. My name is Andreea Pop. I'm an architect at National Institute of Heritage. In the same time, I started to work with Blue Shield International 2 years ago, and this summer I tried hard in the same time to help organizing this event and starting the new the Romanian Blue Shield Committee, which proved to be a suicide mission. So after this hour, if I'm still alive, I'll be happy to join with you for the next days. It's an honor for me to moderate this interesting panel, and I introduce you the guests. So it's James Reap, a professor in the Heritage Conservation Program at the University of Georgia, United States. His research focuses on the legal, administrative, and financial issues of the heritage conservation. He serves as the Vice President of the US Committee of the Blue Shield and is past President of the ICOMOS Legal Committee. Also, Emma Cunliffe, which you know better than I do, is part of the Secretariat of the Blue Shield International and the Senior Research Associate at Newcastle University, England. She is the coordinator for the Blue Shield National Committees, which makes her somehow my boss in the next month, supporting policy and legal implementation and military training. Her research focuses on heritage protection and international law in conflict. Also, we do have next to ours my colleague Iulian Vizauer, archaeologist as professional, but the main is a focal point for a Romanian focal point for the 1954 convention implementing in here in our country. I welcome you, and thank you very much for being with me and allowing me to have some emotions, obvious emotions. This panel is somehow meant to put into questions different issues about conventions we are celebrating today. We also do hope that the people in online can hear us, and we also expect at the end questions from you here in person with us, and also from online. I would start with Emma with some questions, and I would do almost a personal question, working these last days with her, and I would like to know, now that the National Blue Shield Committee is about to establish in Romania, what changes or initiative does Blue Shield International recommend for improving the safeguarding of cultural property?
Okay, thank you very much, and just a huge thank you from me for hosting us and for all your work, both for Blue Shield, hosting our event, and the committee as well, which we're really excited for, because you've done huge amounts of work. So, a lot of my research looks at the Hague Convention and state practice, and then that's what I put into practice in my work through Blue Shield. So it's not so much a legal interpretation as how this all works in practice. And we see a lot of the same things in countries around the world. So the kinds of things that we think are the most useful, first of all, is peacetime preparation. It sounds so obvious, but actually the reality is that a lot of countries think about these things only when it's an emergency, and by then sometimes it's too late. They don't have the resources they need, that they can't collect everything together, or they can't contact the institutions who need to put measures into place. So a lot of pre-planning. And the other reason I say that is one of the other key areas to think about is the Hague Convention tells us that it's what is of great importance to every people that is protected, but that actually is supposed to mean what is of great importance to the communities within your country. And so that's not just what is of interest to you as an architect or me as an archaeologist, but actually what is it that people value? So if you look at what might be a stress point in a conflict. It's about what people think is really valuable to them personally. And actually there's a lot of work to be done there in lining up a kind of sort of expert opinion and then what people just generally might value. Perhaps it's a modern reconstruction that doesn't technically have a sort of heritage integrity and authenticity, but might have a lot of social value for people. And then you need to prioritize all of these sites because you're not going to have enough resources and enough time and enough planning to protect hundreds of thousands of sites. So how do you then pick where to focus? And the more time you have, the more preparations you can put in place, and the more that you can put protective measures in place. And I think that's where Blue Shield actually is really key, which is why it's so wonderful to see it in Romania, because one of our founding principles is bringing together all the different types of heritage. So it's archives, it's libraries, it's monuments, sites, museums, all of the different aspects of heritage to be represented together, to really come and think about what is of value to people and how you can protect it. And then that in turn allows Blue Shield to play a really unique and powerful role as an advisory body for the Hague Convention and just heritage protection and safeguarding more generally.
Thank you very much. My short experience in this showed me that to start having a Blue Shield committee and to start to protect heritage during peacetime, we keep saying during peacetime, usually starts a war. Among institutions, among people, among specialists, among egos, among everybody, it proved that it started a civil war between us. And I looked with interest at the presentation of Professor Stone, and I thought it was so difficult just to get together the first angle of the triangle, not imagine the rest of on. Of course, we do have succeeded with these visits to have our friends from civil protection, for instance, and also from Minister of Defense, but it's such a long journey. It's such a long journey. So I'll turn to Iulian and please tell our guests, because we know exactly what is the current state of cultural heritage protection in Romania and what challenges or gaps exist in implementing the Hague Convention. I think it's open.
Hello. So, 70 years ago, at the Hague Convention, 56 delegates were present between the 21st of April and May the 14th. On May the 14th, 33 of those signed what was to become the UNESCO Convention for the protection of cultural property in case of armed conflict. Our country was one of them. Later on, in 1957, together with the rest of the Eastern Bloc, it was called at that time, we ratified the convention, and the decree of the parliament, then called the Great National Assembly, was published in 1958 in January. So the official date of ratification for Romania of this convention is 1958. Bear in mind that from 1958 until 1990, when we acceded to the World Heritage Convention, and later on in 1993, when we ratified the 1970 UNESCO Convention, the 1954 was the only UNESCO cultural convention we were part of. So this was a rather big deal, especially during the 60s, because the convention was globally rather new. It was not so well populated with state parties. It's not well populated even today, even if there are now 136, I think, state parties. But during the 60s, a small part of the job to be done was commencing to be achieved and accomplished at some level. Because, and I'm referring to the diplomatic level, because you uncover, so to say, last year in the archives of the National Institute of Heritage, the dossier, the 3-volume dossier containing the diplomatic correspondence pertaining to the work that was done by Romania at diplomatic level at that time in regard to this convention. And maybe one of the first projects of this newly to be constituted Blue Shield Romania would be to edit and publish those documents. But generally, many things have to come together right, to come to your question, in order to achieve a successful implementation of the convention. And obviously, one of the sectors to be involved is heritage or culture sector, because it more or less manages the very cultural property which is at the core of the convention. So either national monuments or publicly displayed monuments or libraries, museums, archives, and so on. And then emergency in interior affairs sector, because we tend to expand the 1954 convention, though it is not within its goal, to disasters and climate change nowadays, especially in the last few decades. Obviously, they have to be involved in cases of floods, earthquakes, relief work, and so on. And then national defense, of course, has to be involved. Obviously, it has to be involved during the time of war, but not only. It has to be involved during peacetime. And then there are two more sectors that necessarily have to be involved. The diplomatic sector, because all this kind of conversation has to be done at all levels, either nationally, internally, or internationally, between states, but also between organizations. So I'm including here the cultural diplomacy. And last, but certainly not least, the judiciary. Because if in time of crisis, of war, of internal strife, and so on, destruction of cultural properties is allowed to go unpunished, and impunity tends to go on, because we seem to live now in a mad world, then all of this becomes irrelevant, unfortunately. So there are 5 pillars: heritage, emergency and interior affairs, national defense, diplomacy, and judiciary. The real trouble is that sometimes these 5 pillars don't talk to each other properly with regard to the cultural property protection. And I think this is a goal to be achieved. Some of this we are doing in Romania within the National Advisory Body, as you know, because we're both members of the Romanian National Committee on International Humanitarian Law. Some of the work is done by every institution, heritage, emergency, defense, and so on, but separately. And I think, I repeat myself, a goal should be to talk together on this subject. And I will stop with another thing that I think it will be somehow unachievable goal, but I will give you an example. In 1939, the Second World War obviously broke out in September. Previously, the International Museums Office, which was at the time affiliated with the League of Nations, did two things. Drafted the International Convention specifically addressed to the protection of cultural property in time of war, which unfortunately didn't make it, so to say. It didn't achieve the status of an international instrument. And they issued a handbook on the protection of cultural property in case of attack, war, and so on. And this was done building on the experiences and lessons learned from the Spanish Civil War. So in September, and I'll give you the example of Paris. Many Parisians at the start of the war left to the city to obviously put themselves in a better position, but not all of them. Many of the citizens of Paris actively contributed to the physical protection of, let's say, Notre Dame Cathedral. So Notre Dame, in less than 1 week, I think, it was covered in sandbags to protect it from bombardment. Because the core idea of the ordinary people was, this is important to me. It belongs in some way to me also. I don't want it damaged. So I'm going to help and do everything I can to contribute to physically protect it. So I think this is a major goal, to capture the public opinion in this respect. If someone, as Emma said earlier, identifies a thing, a good, a monument, an archaeological site, to say, this is important to me, I want to do something to protect it. I think it will be wonderful.
Yes, to be honest, yesterday in our visit with Peter and Emma to the site you'll all visit tomorrow, I failed the exam. The main question, what would you grab and run away to evacuate it? I thought about myself that I'm a moderate, trained and educated people in heritage, but no, not in the Blue Shield manner. I almost was feared that we'll do it in Romanian style, from a triangle to a pentagon. I do hope we have the right friends to address the Pentagon in this field. About what Iulian said about the documents, yes, last year accidentally I found in the National Institute of Heritage 3 volumes with I don't know how many hundreds of pages, something like this, about all the documents starting from signing the Hague Convention. I don't know about you, but in our institution and by law we have to unsecret the files if there's something that I'm not sure what's the right term in English. So in our institute there is declassified. Thank you very much. There is a specialized person who had to read all the documents and check them. And he picked up, my colleague picked up 3 papers from that and tried to understand what, and finally he said, I'm sorry, I just cannot find this institution. I don't know what this means. It's a long acronym during that time, and he just kept the papers. This is the current status in Romania, but we try hard and we work even harder. So speaking about all these documents, international documents, please, James, would you like to tell us more about synergies between the 1954 and the 1970 conventions?
Yes, thank you. Obviously one of the outcomes of conflict is usually the theft and looting, the trafficking of cultural property. And our Committee of the Blue Shield in the U.S. has taken an active role in engagement with our Cultural Property Advisory Committee. I won't go into any detail, but the 1954 convention is viewed by our defense establishment as largely self-executing. But the 1970 convention, our Congress passed the Convention on Cultural Property Implementation Act, and it institutes a committee called the Cultural Property Advisory Committee. And that committee advises our State Department and the President on the execution of bilateral agreements with other countries to restrict the import of cultural property into the United States without proper documentation of legal export from those countries. And being one of the major market countries, we do have a large influx of illicitly transported cultural property. And we find that one of the most effective ways to deal with that in our system is the participation in the Cultural Property Advisory Committee. Our current president of the U.S. Blue Shield, Patty Gerstenblith, is a former chair of the Cultural Property Advisory Committee. I and several of our other members have served on it. And what we have found is that we can take action, unfortunately after the fact, after the property has been stolen and transported, to begin to repatriate it to the countries involved. And one of the provisions of the Cultural Property Implementation Act is the negotiation of emergency provisions with countries that are in conflict, active conflict, and their cultural property is being actively transported. And so we have had emergency agreements with a variety of countries, with Syria, with Libya, with Iraq, with Yemen, and just this year, an emergency provision being negotiated on the recommendation of the Cultural Property Advisory Committee with Ukraine. And so we find that in addition to our activities of public information and engagement with our military, that the work with the Cultural Property Implementation Committee and the return of illicitly obtained cultural property from conflict is a way that we can contribute to the overall protection of cultural property. And so I think it may be a similar opportunity for other committees to look at ways that they can get proactively involved in preventing the dispersal of cultural property that's unfortunately stolen, looted during conflict.
Thank you. In this idea, Iulian, how can Romania effectively implement the provisions of the Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property?
Well, I'm going to build on what I said earlier. We have to talk to each other on this subject more and more effectively. We also have to spread the word is not the right wording for it, but we have to make people aware of the abundance of cultural property that needs protecting. As you know, the convention has, under the term protection, has two crucial cardinal concepts: safeguarding and respect. Usually safeguarding is what is to be done about the convention during peacetime. So all the preparations of the cultural sector, of the emergencies and the national defense have to do during peacetime in order to achieve a better state of preparation in case of armed conflict. And the respect is the attitude taken towards the cultural property during the conflict. So we have much to do in the safeguarding aspect of the protection of the cultural property. We have many national monuments. There are over, I think, physically over 60,000 buildings with this legal status. I think the number of registered archaeological sites will reach shortly 100,000. There are over 30,000 publicly displayed monuments, statues, and so on. And according to a statistic released 2 years ago by our National Institute of Statistics, there are 133 million movable cultural objects, most of them in libraries, but of those 31 million that are movable cultural goods in museums. And bear in mind that this statistics does not cover religious establishments and archives. So potentially there is we have a huge task ahead of us.
You just give to the enemy all the information needed.
I hope I answered at least partially your question.
Yes. In this order, what would be, James, what would be the lessons that we can learn from the experience of Blue Shield in countries like Iraq and USA?
I would have to say that I hope that other countries don't have this experience, don't have this impetus for ratifying the Hague Convention or establishing Blue Shield, but we found ourselves in Iraq unprepared. Our military was really unprepared to deal with cultural property. While the military manuals addressed it, the commanders in the field were simply not prepared. And some of the results, certainly the world has seen. The looting of the museum in Baghdad, for example. As an occupying power, we would have had responsibility to protect those properties. Our military should not have found itself encamped in Babylon, but we did. But that served really as a wake-up call to the United States. While we were participants in the negotiation of the Hague Convention in the 1950s and signed it initially, the president never sent it to Congress for ratification. And so more than 50 years passed before the U.S. Ratified the Hague Convention and did not ratify specifically the protocols. That is one of the goals of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, is to work to convince our Congress to ratify the second protocol. But what happened is that conflict, that in a way, that embarrassment not only to the members of the public that we were somehow complicit in the destruction of cultural property, but that our military was unprepared to deal with it. Although there were professionals in the military capable of doing so, that it encouraged the ratification of the convention. And, in a way, the creation of the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, because one of those military personnel, who was a museum professional, Corey Wegener, when she returned home to the United States, she was the incorporator, the person that formed the Committee of the Blue Shield. So out of that experience, that really unfortunate experience in Iraq, it taught us the lesson that we needed to be prepared legally through the convention, training through our military, and a non-governmental organization, the Blue Shield, would have a role of supporting that. So those were unfortunately hard-learned lessons in that experience. But I think it's an example for other countries that to avoid that kind of situation.
Yes, thank you. Through all these ideas, I identified at least two major problems, but I come back to Emma, and I would like her to develop a little. What do you think are the greatest challenges implementing the convention, except initiating a Blue Shield Committee, National Blue Shield Committee?
The greatest challenges, because if we just listed the challenges, we might be here a while. It is, without doubt, globally, a very poorly implemented convention. And there's my own academic research, there are reports on UNESCO's website. It is very badly implemented by most countries, as Peter said this morning as well. And some people say, well, there's no funding. But actually, I think the problem goes slightly higher than that. And the first step is a lack of awareness that it exists at all, in fact. Too many people don't know what a Blue Shield is, the way that they do know what a Red Cross is. But that really shows itself in two ways. So, for example, with defense, Article 7 of the Convention says two things. It says that you must make a specialist military unit. And here we can look to the work of the US, for example. They have an Army Monuments Officers Training Program now that trains their Army to go out, and if they're trained in how to deal with cultural property when they encounter it in the field. That's great. The UK has a cultural property protection unit. But honestly, I think I can count the number of specialist units on my fingers. And that's out of the 135-6 countries that have ratified. And it's not enough just to have in your military training to say, if you see cultural property, it is protected. Because actually, what does that, and here are the requirements of military necessity, so you can attack it if it's necessary, but you have to do it in a way that is proportionate to the advantage you expect. And actually, we have for all your excitement, the Implementing Respect panel was the workshop that got the top votes. We'll be talking about this a lot on Thursday. But actually, what does that mean in practice then? Can I attack it? Can I not? How important is it? Who is it important to? What will the consequences be? Those are very real issues that need to be worked through. You can't encounter them for the first time in the middle of a major military operation when you don't have time. So planning for all of this is a huge task in peacetime. But the other thing that military forces need to do in the convention is cooperate with the authorities responsible for safeguarding. And that's a huge gulf. The military think that it's a cultural convention. The cultural people know the military need to be involved. And actually bridging that gap is a huge piece of work because it's not something in a conflict either of them can do. And they both have a really important role to play. And my first job when I go out to NATO or wherever I have to do my military training is to convince people that this isn't just a nice-to-have add-on, that actually this matters. And I know I'm obviously preaching to converted people in this room, but when we talk to armed forces, I think it's really important to remember that the convention was written after World War I, the first draft, then the Spanish Civil War, World War II. It was written by people who saw huge amounts of warfare, and they looked at the consequences, and they looked at what happened, and they thought, how can we prevent this ever happening again? By soldiers who had fought, who had been on the military front lines, And that was what they came away thinking, is we need to do better next time. It's a founding principle of international humanitarian law that the right to wage war is not unlimited. And this is just one element of that. But then the other way that it expresses itself is when we turn back to the heritage sector. And we're very quick, and I'm sorry to people who I know are doing this, we're very quick to talk about climate change and disaster because those are very real threats that we face on a day-to-day basis. And I don't want to take away from the importance of them. And of course, the measures in the convention can assist with them. But at heart, they are often distractions from the reality of implementing the convention. They let us tell ourselves that we have implemented disaster risk preparedness because we have focused on, and I use this word very loosely, natural disasters. But actually, the measures you need for conflict are complementary, but they are not the same as a disaster. Perhaps you have an emergency plan that says, oh yes, the fire brigade will respond because I have a fire. Well, actually, in a conflict, maybe only a third of the emergency services are operating. And is it your institution that they're going to come to? Maybe, maybe not. Is your building actually going to get commandeered as a food distribution centre or an emergency hospital? And the ways that you have to think through your plans become very different, actually, and especially over the long term. A disaster hits and you might be dealing with it. For sure, the repercussions will last a long, long time. But if you have an earthquake and then it's over, maybe you have the aftershocks, but then you deal with the aftermath. But for a conflict, it can take years before you can even start to pick up the pieces and work out what you do next. Is your emergency storage facility for your objects even equipped for that? And when you then think about how you evacuate your collections and where you're going to take them to, we saw in Ukraine that they didn't have all of the resources for sandbags for all of their institutions and emergency packing materials. And half of Europe came together to ship them what they needed. But actually then if every country suddenly said, well, actually we need that now, then it's not going to be available. And those really hard choices have to be made. You're not going to be able to protect 60,000 buildings and 100,000 archaeological sites. You have to make a shortlist. So, and that's really tough to do. And there's a lot of different ways countries have done that. Some haven't done it at all. Some have maybe 50 sites on their list. And that's what special and enhanced protection are also meant to help you with, to help prioritize those sites that need the highest levels of protection. And they're linked to command authority. So the amount of people who can make military decisions regarding them is extremely limited, and failure to adhere to that in anything except immediate self-defense is a war crime in some circumstances. So they're there, but they're barely used. Up until 12 months ago, we had like 17 sites on the enhanced protection list, and everybody said, well, it's very difficult to apply for, maybe. But that's not even a bit true, because we have 1,200 sites on the World Heritage List, 700, biospheres. And these are complicated registration processes involving a lot of communication and planning. And if we can do it for that, we have to be able to do it for our own preparedness. But that's the last real challenge to overcome, is people don't want to face the reality of conflict, even as a planning measure, because the reality is then very difficult to deal with, and it's politically sensitive and it's complicated. But that doesn't make the reality of conflict any less of those issues either. So there are many challenges to overcome, which actually is why the more you do it in peacetime, when any kind of reality is far away and it's almost hypothetical, the easier it will be.
About the shortlist, I remember a discussion with Iulian with half a smile. We were thinking about our shortlist. Naturally, you're thinking about, National Museum of Art. That would be the first point on the map. Just that this building is across the seat of the Minister of Internal Affairs. So I don't think it would be a right one, at least not for the beginning. But just a mental exercise that we are doing, and with other, from those thousands of monuments, that not to mention the listed on UNESCO list, our monuments on UNESCO sites.
Any short or enlarged list has to be run through the military.
Yeah, definitely.
Because another key concept of the convention is the cultural property is protected in case of armed conflict as long as it's not being used for military purposes.
Yeah.
So naturally, the defense authorities have to check that list and maybe
if we are
underline
able to discuss with them.
some objective that they consider is important for the national defense of the country, and so on.
No, I just gave this example in the way we are start thinking about it. To be honest, going deeper these last 2 years in the research, in all the meetings with you and discussions with you, this is that kind of job that you are involved with, you want to do it, and you do hope that it will be proved to be useless. Yes. To be useless in the end. You just pray to be useless. My colleagues from above announced me that there is no online questions, but I do hope that our guest here, thank you very much.
It's not a question, just a very short comment. 31 years after Romania has ratified the Hague Convention, we had the violent uprising against Ceausescu. And the Central Library of University Library of Romania, which is right in the center of Bucharest, together and with the National Museum of Art of Romania, which it's also the former Royal Palace, both were under attack. The library was on fire. Some of the most important manuscripts in Romanian culture has perished, and a lot of paintings in the National Art Museum were also destroyed. No military was ever informed. I'm speaking about the military, the staff of the military of the Romanian army, because both buildings were attacked by the military. Nobody was ever informed about the existence of the Hague Convention. I was a military myself from 1978 to 1980. Nobody ever informed us, and not even the officers were informed about the existence of this convention. I'm not sure. I hope that things have improved in Romania after Romania became a democratic country. I hope at least that the existence of this convention is mentioned to those who are graduating the military academy, but I'm not very sure.
So yes, it's one of those cases which clearly fall under the 1954 convention, and is one of those cases that has never been prosecuted properly, even according to the old criminal code, which was better in this respect than the actual criminal code we have. So yeah, it's a sad memory, so to say. In 1989, important cultural property, both movable and immovable, were attacked both by civilians and the military, I think. These things are better precised in the second protocol. It's true, but that was to appear 10 years on, so it wasn't the case.
Just a short. Last year, having this post-conflict recovery training, we have to prepare a paper about my country. And of course, a revolution from 1989 was the most recent conflict I could write about, or at least to make just a brief presentation. And having this revolution square with the buildings that my colleagues just mentioned before, there is a wonderful picture with all the tanks pointed to the National Museum of Art. Me, knowing the neighborhoods, I said, the enemy is in the other side. If you think there is an enemy, as I said, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also the library that we are talking about. And as Iulian mentioned, no one was tried for heritage destruction at all. Not only for all the other in the conflict, but not for...
But oddly, they still could, because this is a crime against humanity, which has no end time of prescription.
Yeah, please.
So when I say the convention is badly implemented, we can also add that there are no national prosecutions that we know of. The prosecutions for heritage destruction internationally are at the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court under the Rome Statute. There are some national prosecutions under domestic, like heritage protection legislation, because you damaged or destroyed heritage, or under terrorist legislation, but never one for the Hague Convention. But I can at least say in slightly good news, when I was with NATO earlier this year, there were some Romanian colleagues there, and they definitely knew what the convention was. We had a long chat about it. So I assume it is definitely being taught now, if that helps.
Yes, it does. We already noticed this morning a colleague from Ministry of Defense assured us that they do trainings who help you. But this kind of events help in connecting people and institutions. So please, if you do dare to have another questions for my... yes, please.
Try it out. Okay. We see this reasonable difference between the signatory states to the Hague Convention and to the protocols. And particularly United States, what do you think are the main or the crucial objectives or obstacles to sign the protocol? Has it to do with the indemnity clause, so eventually with the art trade, or what are the main objections from all these states not to sign the protocols?
I think in the case of the protocols, there is the concern from some in the military that the additional provisions for example, requiring decisions made by commanders at the very highest levels would make the execution of military operation much more difficult. I don't think they've come to the conclusion that they're ready to embrace that. I think there's an opening for it, and I think that the decision is going to depend primarily on political considerations in Congress. I don't think there's the widespread objections from the military, but I think there are those kind of concerns about the more restrictive provisions.
I would agree with that, but also for some countries, the convention's judicial clauses are the protocol's judicial clauses are much clearer than the convention on universal criminal jurisdiction and how any country can prosecute anybody else if they commit a crime. And I think a lot of countries are resistant to opening up their nationals to prosecution by other countries in that way. So that's definitely a concern for some. A lot of people look at the second protocol, but actually of the 86 or 88 countries that signed the second protocol, 5 refused to sign the first protocol. In one case, it's because they said that it was already covered by their own legislation in other ways. But in the others, it's because good faith purchase law for looted objects gives you, or potentially looted objects gives you title in those countries, and so they don't want to change or they can't change their whole legal system for the first protocol clauses on return. So there's issues about what constitutes a good faith title in some countries as well. But I think a lot of it is either, those issues aside, a lot of it is either state apathy. If they haven't really implemented the convention, they're not going to rush to implement the second protocol. And as James said, I think concerns about military execution and that criminal jurisdiction clauses. But I also think every time we get a conflict, like a big one that takes over international news, because obviously there are many going on that never quite attain that status, we get a sudden rush of people ratifying the convention again as they look at it and realise that actually most of its provisions are very practical, it's got a lot of sensible measures, most of the military provisions are actually in customary law already, they're all in the Geneva Convention additional protocols, the ones that people are concerned about, and most countries have signed those. So they're already sort of becoming better known and more established, at least. So hopefully in the future more people will turn to the convention, and ideally without a major conflict occupying the news, reminding them that they should.
Regarding some of those concerns, you do remember that military necessity almost didn't make it in the 1954 convention. It was a huge debate at the conference 70 years ago, and was more or less pushed in the text politically.
By the UK, who then didn't ratify it.
The
Signed it and then didn't put it into
by the
law.
US and the UK, yes.
Neither of whom ratified it at the time. So we insisted on the wording.
But had this thing occurred, many of those concerns wouldn't exist.
But if they had, you'd have had to have a much, much, much tighter definition of what your cultural property is.
Yes.
There's no way it can apply in any
Yes.
practical sense to hundreds of thousands of objects. In every scenario we've ever run, it is too difficult to operate with a map that is basically just covered in blue shields. You can't move. So you can either
the
have it
majority
where
of commentators already say that the definition of the cultural property in the 54 Convention is too loose, too general. It lacks a sense of real applicability.
That's very much up to each country. Like some countries have picked 50 places, and some have very clearly marked tens of thousands. So there is a balance, I think, between them. And I think when you look at a lot of the examples it's based on in World War II, and in fact from conflicts more recently, there are plenty of ways that actually it's not difficult, because it's not about necessarily protecting places, although there are major places, perhaps like the National Museum of Iraq, that could have been factored into planning a lot better. But actually a lot of it is things like, don't maybe use that historic house as your headquarters and then ruin it by that use. Pick somewhere else. You know, it's not so difficult to do that. Do you need to camp at Babylon? Actually, no, you didn't. You could have been somewhere else. And so, actually, that's why, for me, the convention has these levels of protection. You have your just places under normal protection, where if they fall into military use, they fall into military use, but so often they don't need to. And it's really interesting reading the journals of the monuments men and their experiences, which I think very much influence some of this. So even just... there's one account of a captain, and he's looking at a historic house that has been mostly damaged, but there's some beautiful statuary that he wants to save, because it's all that's left of it. And there's another guy from another branch of the army trying to bring bulldozers in because he wants the brickwork to make rubble to make a road. And they have a big argument about it, and eventually he says the statue, and he's like, because it wasn't necessary. That's, you know, as Eisenhower terms it, indifference, inconvenience, but it wasn't necessary. And so there are so many examples of that where actually it's quite easy to just make a different choice and protect something just by changing your actions. And then for those more complicated issues, if they're more likely to need protecting, you can put them under special protection, although I accept it's complicated, or under enhanced protection, which isn't.
And we come back to the numbers. because the international register only contains 18 positions, of which 3, I think, were scrapped by the state parties that introduced them. Now the international list of the property under enhanced protection has 55 objectives, but only those fall under the immunity which has been granted by the convention, the 1954 convention. There is a lower level of protection, of course, the general level, the majority of monuments, museums, libraries, like archives and so on, and religious buildings, obviously. But in this respect, I think I'm more comfortable with the notion of neutrality from the Roerich Pact than to the concept of immunity from the 1954 Convention, because there is a clear difference. Neutral is neutral. It doesn't infringe either to either side of the conflict. Immunity kind of attracts attention. Although we know that this concept of immunity is a juridical concept which grants formal protection, and if you attack or destroy cultural property that it is immune, is clearly a war crime and can be prosecuted under the international law.
Okay,
but maybe something to think about for the future of the convention: neutrality versus immunity.
And in
I
fact,
don't know.
very specifically, because otherwise we will be here forever, we can think about it on Thursday in the Implementing Respect workshop, where we will unpick this in a lot of detail.
Yes, it was almost in my power to let you both alone here and invite our guests to a lunch. I think I deserve my lunch in this crisis moderating panel, and I thank you very much. I do thank you very much. One last shot. Is there any other question? Oh. No, it's perfect.
Thank you. My name is Helen from Sweden. I was just thinking now, when you are talking about what is the definition of cultural property, what about this immaterial cultural heritage? Because we are talking a lot about that, and maybe that's a big question before lunch. But I think it is, we are discussing a lot in Sweden that it's not only protection of the physical objects, it's also what kind of activities do we keep up if we are in a conflict. We can also see in Ukraine, for example, now they talk a lot about immaterial heritage culture, traditions, their right to go on with their language, their culture, traditions. So how does this fit into the convention?
Okay, so it doesn't particularly. That's actually quite a simple one. So, this is my personal opinion. I'm sure somebody at some point will correct me when I sit up and say this. So if there are objects that you need for those traditions, they can be protected if somebody deems them to be of great importance. So, if you have traditional clothing or, instruments or whatever. But when you come to the actual people you can digitize them, and actually, though, even the digital records can be protected as cultural property. There's some really great legal arguments for digital heritage protection. But what you really mean is the people who practice them. And then, actually, as a heritage community, we need to be on very careful ground, because what you don't want to say is intangible heritage bearers are also people, like all the other people at risk in conflict, but they're special and deserve extra protection, unlike normal people. And we need to be very careful there, because they're civilians, and like all civilians, they are protected under the Geneva Conventions if they're not taking part in conflict. So the best that we can really do is, actually, I think we have to distinguish them from the convention, because the convention tries to make a special category for protection. And we don't want to do that with people. some people are not worth more protection than other people. So, yeah. No, exactly, but that's sometimes where it goes, and that's why we have to be quite careful. So all we can really do is make sure that there is additional funding available for supporting the intangible traditions that people want to bring with them if they leave, or that we are recording them and making sure that they are transmitted and that there are those facilities to do that. But they don't actually fit under the convention, I don't think, really.
Time for one last one? So I was, I think, Emma, you were talking about earlier, I was very interested to hear the difference between preparing for disaster in sort of a climatological sense versus preparing for warfare and, you know, actual conflict and how they differ. And I was just thinking, like, I was part of a massive, or not massive, but a large-scale salvage operation fairly recently, and we realized that even though we'd done all this planning, nobody had any scissors. You know, everyone was like, wait a second, God, why don't we have it? We need all these scissors. I was just wondering, you know, what would be the scissors, the overlooked things, something sort of small scale that you find is often overlooked in conflict preparedness?
That would be giving you the answers to tomorrow's workshop. Have fun tomorrow.
No spoilers. Yeah.
No spoilers, sorry. Although I will say that actually we, Blue Shield International, have a guidance pack that is currently in draft preparation that will look at this in a lot more detail. We're going to hopefully release that towards the end of this year. But the sort of focus of things like that is what we're going to be doing tomorrow. So,
See how good is it without officials? Okay, thank you very much. I do invite you to lunch because at 2 o'clock sharp, it will start the General Assembly and we should be back in the room, please. Thank you very much to you and to our guests.